So let's get into this recipe, menudo. And also, let me tell you who I am, just in case you're not super familiar with me. My name is Jocelyn. I'm the chef and founder of Todo Verde here in Los Angeles, and I focus on plant-based Mexican food. I'm really trying to recreate recipes that I grew up eating, and menudo is definitely one of them. I was telling somebody recently, because I did a few trial runs to test the recipe, because I kind of cook on a whim. I feel the ingredients rather than measure them out. And so then when I actually need to measure them out, I make sure that I give people opportunities to taste and let me know how, if it needs a little bit more of this and that. And people were just so shocked by it, you know? And for me, it's really important for it to feel as close to the real deal as possible. And menudo, as I was saying, is something that on the weekends, my family and I, sometimes my mom would cook it. She wasn't always a huge fan of like getting into the stomach lining of the cow, but if she wasn't into doing that on that day, we would take a pot to our local restaurant just a few blocks away, fill up the pot with menudo, pay for it, head back home with the pot, you know? And it was just something that we did typically on Sundays, especially if, you know, we went to church, we'd take the pot with us and then let's go swing by and pick up the menudo after church. So it's just definitely something that I think that we almost ate more regularly than pozole. And some people were not a fan of the stomach lining of the animal. Some people were not a fan of the, you know, there's usually like a whole like hoof in the in the menudo as well too. Some people love it. I know my dad was a huge fan. But now I'm trying to create that same nostalgic feeling in a plant-based version. So I'm gonna walk you through some of the ingredients that I'm using. Most of them are the same. Actually, a majority of them are the same exact ingredients. The only thing that's really different is we're using mushrooms instead of the stomach lining. So this is like a tried true menudo recipe. We'll get right into it. And it's so easy. It's seriously so easy. Like once you see me kind of breeze through this, you're gonna be like, oh, I can totally do that, no problem. I think the biggest issue is probably trying to find the snow mushrooms. And I'll show you what they look like in just a moment, a little bit more up close. But the snow mushrooms can be purchased at most Asian grocery stores, most Chinese grocery stores. You can buy them online. I saw that a lot of people happen to sell them on Etsy for whatever reason, which is kind of interesting. But if you go to a Chinese grocery store, they're readily available. They're really affordable. And if you can't find snow mushrooms, which have that very similar texture as the stomach lining that's typically used in menudo, you can also use oyster mushrooms. Now, there's a few different varieties of oyster mushrooms. I actually don't have them on hand right now. They didn't have them at my local grocery store, so I can't really show you exactly, but the main two differentiators are the king oyster mushrooms, where the kind of the trunk of the mushroom is really thick and stocky, and the top is really tiny. And then the other type of mushroom that I use more of is not king oyster, it's regular oyster mushrooms, and they're typically in a little bunch, and the stems are a lot more narrow and thin, and the tops of the mushrooms are much bigger. Now that's more the variety that I would use for this menudo recipe, just because I want to focus more on the mushroom tops and having those kind of be in place of the meat that we would use in a typical menudo. So let me get into a couple things. The first thing is the corn. So I'm using,
quickly
go ahead.
before we get into that. Can we use fresh mushroom for the recipe or only dried?
Great, I just answered that. So we can use definitely the fresh oyster mushrooms that I mentioned, and there's the two different varieties. So I just covered that right now. Anything else? No? Okay. So for the corn, I'm using here a brand that I get from this online organization called Native Seeds. They're based in Arizona. But the company that it makes the maiz itself is called Los Chileros, and it's already nixtamalized corn, it's organic. This is yellow corn, And what the nixtamal process is, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially you're having the corn go through the process of being soaked in calcium limestone, where you are able to remove the outer shell or the outer husk of the corn that is a little bit difficult to digest for us. And so it's already gone through that process, and then it's been dehydrated once again or dried once again. And so if you are using this, it doesn't have to be this exact brand, but if you're using something that says it's already been, it's ready to be pozole, or it's already been nixtamalized, then all you have to do is you have to just soak it overnight and drain that liquid out, put some new liquid in, and then turn on your stove. Anytime I'm making pozole, menudo, whatever, and I'm using maiz, you want to make sure that you have at least 2 inches of water over the maiz. So as it's cooking, obviously it's going to absorb some of that liquid, and you have to come back and keep adding water to it and make sure that it has at least that 2 inches covering or over the maiz, and you should be pretty good. You don't want it to dry out, and you want to make sure that you get that super flavorful maiz flavor in the broth. And so that's what this is going to do. And you also want to salt liberally. You want to make sure you have a good amount of salt. So I just want to show you real quick my pot over here on the stove. And I have it on pretty low heat right now. It's been cooking for some time now. And you can see here, let me bring my ladle over so you can check this out. And I think you should be able to see this pot fairly well. I'll tip it over a little bit so you can see a bit better as I work. But what I'm looking for here is, again, about 2 inches of water covering over the maiz. And then you can see here that the maiz, some of them have bloomed, which means they've kind of popped open. And I love that. I love that texture in the maiz, and you know that it's cooked fairly well. And you want to taste at least 5 kernels of maiz, because sometimes you have some that are, you know, closer to the heat source and they'll pop and they'll bloom a lot faster, and you have others that are not fully cooked. So the rule of thumb is if you taste about 5 of them, and they're all feeling like they're tender and they're cooked through, then the whole batch should be cooked through. And so it's so good. You want to make sure, again, that it's flavored well. I put a good amount of salt in there. And the other thing I will say is that I did a little bit of a shortcut. So I was just talking to Susana before we started the class, and I was saying you don't need a lot of tools in your kitchen, right? There is one that is kind of an appliance that I like to use, which is an Instapot. And I have an Instapot, and it saves me a ton of time. It's more of like, you don't really need it. You can definitely, you know, do what I mentioned earlier, which is, you know, soak overnight, turn on your stove about 2 hours before class, you know, or whenever you want to start to assemble the whole dish together. But the Instapot, I didn't soak overnight. So I'll start with saying that I didn't soak overnight. And then I was like, oh my goodness, I have to make sure that I do that. So I threw it in the Instapot for 50 minutes, and it cooked almost completely. And then I've been cooking it ever since, which I took it out of the Instapot maybe about an hour and a half ago. And so essentially what it did is the pressure, because it's a pressure cooker, allowed the water to penetrate more quickly into the kernels of maiz, rather than the soaking process and just soaking in lukewarm water overnight. So that's a little shortcut if you happen to have a tool like that, like a pressure cooker. So that's the maiz. I'm gonna let that hang out until we get into the other ingredients, but it's ready to go. And that's when I know, all right, let me get my other elements ready to go as well. So any questions about the maiz process? And now I just have it on super low heat. It's just essentially staying hot, or really warm hot, and then it's not really cooking any further at this point. So the other element that I also have on my stove that I want to just point out before I get into the mushrooms themselves is the mushrooms need a little bit of preparation. And so what I have here on my stove in a much smaller pot is some vegetable broth. And I just want to make sure that it's warm, or that it's heated through, that it's not room temperature or cold. I know some of us store vegetable broth that's open in the fridge. So you just want to make sure that it's hot or really warm. so that it helps to rehydrate the mushrooms much faster. And what I used here is not a regular vegetable broth. I'm going to come back to my countertop here and show you the product that I like to use for this. So there's this product called Better Than Bouillon. You may have seen it at your local grocery store, and they have a couple versions. One of them is just like a vegetable based broth. I mean, they're both vegetable based, but the other one is more like flavored like vegetable broth. And this one is more flavored like chicken. And I know that Menudo is not a chicken base, but I wanted to, the last round that I did, I wanted to really try this because I felt like I wanted the mushrooms to already kind of feel like they have their own flavor before bringing it into the pot, the larger pot of menudo. And so using this helps to give the mushrooms their own more distinct flavor, especially because they're going to keep that moisture that they absorb from the dehydration process to rehydrating, and it's going to be a delicious base. So I used 4 teaspoons of this paste, which I'll show you what it looks like. It literally is just sort of this slightly runny paste here. And this one is a yellow color because it has a little bit of turmeric in it. So again, that Better Than Bouillon paste. And then the other thing that I'm going to add is this recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of ground cumin. I'm going to add half of that. So I'm going to add a half teaspoon of cumin. And then because this is a paste, you have to add for each teaspoon a cup of water. So it was 4 teaspoons of this paste to 4 cups of water. And I brought that up to temperature so that it can dilute the paste. I'm gonna run my whisk through it just to make sure I don't have any pieces that didn't dissolve, but I'm pretty sure they all did. And then again, I'm gonna add about a half teaspoon. Let me grab my measuring spoon here. So I'm gonna come back to my stove. I have here my whole teaspoon of my cumin, but I'm just gonna add a half teaspoon to this liquid because I really like the way that the cumin also gives a little bit of a depth of flavor and makes the broth feel a little bit more kind of meaty, gamey. I'm not quite sure always what like the word is. I need to like look up cumin and see how people describe cumin to be able to better describe it. So this liquid is good to go for me. I'll taste to see if it needs any salt. And it's good. That broth, the Better Than Bouillon definitely has a little bit of that salt in it, so it doesn't need too much more. And I'm gonna come back to my counter and do an up close and personal view of the snow mushrooms. So let me break open the bag here. Use my knife. Maybe I should have opened it right before class. There we go. Okay, so snow mushrooms. They are a delicacy in Chinese cuisine, and they're used a lot for, believe it or not, I saw that people use them a lot for desserts. I'm not quite sure how, but it's pretty interesting. So it's a mushroom that has been dried. They're typically like an off-white kind of cream color, and they're hard. But they're also delicate. So, you know, if I started to really overhandle this bag, it would break like a bag of chips. So this is a snow mushroom. It's not a super familiar ingredient for a lot of people, but it ends up lending to a really amazing texture that looks so much like the stomach lining that you see in menudo. So all you have to do is essentially put this into your broth and let the rehydration process happen. These are, I've used different brands, different bags. This is a 2.5 ounce. Actually, this is 6 ounces. So I haven't ever used this one before. All right, interesting. So I'll end up using about a half or so of this bag because we only really need about 3 ounces. And so if you find that you are running low, like you perhaps need a bit more liquid, the amount of liquid, the 4 cups should be totally fine. But if you need more, you can always add a little bit more of the broth or water. So again, just dropping these into the broth, allowing them to rehydrate, and then we'll come back to them after about like 20 minutes, perhaps 30 minutes. And while we get the other elements of our menudo ready for the broth itself, the chiles and the onion and the garlic and things like that. But we'll come back to it once it is rehydrated, once they're tender and soft, and we'll use our knife to break them down. Because of course, this is huge. And once it rehydrates, it's gonna be even bigger. The other bags that I've used, they're already kind of broken up in pieces, where this one is just like a huge mushroom top. So you'll need to break it down, because you can't imagine like taking this directly from like your plate into your spoon into your mouth. It's huge. So let's go ahead and drop these into our vegetable broth here that's preheated on the stove. I'm just literally gonna drop them in there. It's gonna float for a second because and you can already see here that it's already getting a bit soft. Just from that like immediate touching the liquid, I could already see that the sides here are soft and this liquid is hot. Let me throw in another one. I'll probably be able to fit about 3 or 4 in here. And I'll come in every once in a while and like move them around just to make sure that they're all fully submerged and that they've all had a chance to really get into the liquid. Let me throw in a couple more. Probably just throw in, let's see, there's a half one. And I'll throw in this one. Okay.
And Jocelyn, Gina wanted to know if they were expensive. Susanna helped us out and said that they're about $3.50 at 99 Ranch Market. Does that sound about right to you, in that range?
That's correct. Yeah. So they're not too expensive at all. They're pretty affordable. 99 Ranch Market is absolutely like the spot to go in San Gabriel Valley. I think it's on, I can't remember the name of the street that it's on. Not Garvey, but the other main street there. And that's where I go. Like I love to go to 99 Ranch Market. It's like my fun place, but I don't go there often. So when I go, I like to stock up. And so, you know, for this recipe, I actually bought like 3 or 4. I think they had maybe like 3 different types of snow mushrooms, like different bags. And so I got all of them so that I can see how each one is. So this is my first time using this this brand, where they're just so huge. So, but it should be just like the other ones. Hopefully the flavor is the same too. So the only thing I'll do here is just, I'm gonna use my whisk that I used earlier to kind of push them down into the liquid and kind of help the process along. So I'll let that hang out. I'll come by in a few, and I'll essentially like kind of move them over or flip them over, so that whatever's on top is going to be at the bottom. And, you know, I'll grab my tongs and kind of move that around. So I'll just cover that. It's not on, it's not boiling them or anything like that. The liquid was already warm. So it's just allowing them to sit in hot liquid or super warm liquid, but I'm not cooking them because they are going to cook a little bit in the menudo and I don't want to overdo it. Okay, so that's just going to hang out on the side here. And I'm going to bring my cast iron skillet to my stove. So I'm going to turn on, I'm going to preheat my cast iron as I talk about my next ingredients. All right, so let's talk about chiles. And if you know me and you've been to my classes before and you've cooked from my cookbook, you'll know that I don't use a whole lot of onion and garlic. In fact, it's an ingredient that is like pretty sparse, like throughout the book and the work that I do with Todo Verde. That's just a personal preference. I don't personally eat a lot of onion and garlic, but for this recipe, it just isn't quite right without it. There are a few, like whenever I make tinga, for example, you can't really make tinga without onion and garlic, right? And so menudo is another one of those. And I think that it really, for me, distinguishes the flavors that I have in my pozole and the flavors that I have in this menudo recipe. So onion and garlic central today. We're gonna be using 6 peeled garlic cloves, and I have some fairly large ones here. And then I have 1 yellow onion that I just peeled and quartered. So we're gonna use these in a second. after we pan fry our chiles. And the chiles that we're going to be using are the typical chiles that you would see that would flavor and stain a broth that you see in a menudo. And so we have here 8 guajillo chiles, and guajillos are fairly mild in their spiciness and their capsaicin. They're these narrow, long chiles that can pack a punch. I find when they're a bit smaller, the larger they are, the less spicy they seem to be. These we'll see, but I've used these already, this batch, so I think that they're fairly mild. It provides a little bit of heat, but not really enough to make you running, go running for water. But the smaller they are a bit more spicy because the seeds are so close to the skin, and that really makes the skin of the chiles a little bit more fiery. And I've already destemmed the chiles. I removed as many seeds as I could. There might still be a few seeds in there. It's all good. And I gave them a good rinse. You always want to, first of all, try to find chiles that are not too crunchy. The more dry they are usually means that they've been picked a long time and they've been drying for a long time. So they're kind of old chiles. But right now, like I went to a Mexican grocery store near me and I saw that the chiles weren't the ideal types of chiles that I'd like to buy, but I'm like, it's COVID. I'm not going to run around trying to get each ingredient from like specialty places, like a place that specializes in chiles, which is what I do typically. And then the other chile variety that we see here is an ancho chile, called ancho because that means wide, and this chile is wider. And these are in fact the chile pasilla or the chile poblanos that we typically see in, for chiles rellenos. This is that chile that has then been in a dried form. And this is really, for me, not spicy at all. Every once in a while you will get one that is pretty spicy, but usually very, very low in the capsaicin level. And again, because the skin is so far removed from the seeds and isn't as spicy, it reminds me of a just gently spiced raisin. It has a little bit of sweetness to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pan fry these in some oil on the cast iron that I'm preheating now. And once these are complete, once we see a little bit of searing happening, a slight bit of blackening that's going to happen. Now, somebody in a recent class was like how much is like the blackening that we want to see? And they had actually like burnt theirs, and they get bitter if you burn them. So you don't want to overdo it. You just want to get something that starts to make your chiles really fragrant and starts to release the oils of the chiles and kind of wakes them up. They've been dormant and sleeping for a while. And so you just want to really kind of get a more flavorful kind of aroma out of them. And then once these are pulled out, we're going to put them in a bowl of warm water just so they can start to rehydrate. And we're going to let those hang out for at least a good like 10 minutes or so. And then once we pull those out and put them in the warm water, we'll pan fry our onion and garlic. And then this is all going to go together in a blender and get blended up to make our broth using some of that rehydrating liquid. So let's go ahead. Ooh, my pan is hot. It is smoking. Let me lower that temperature. I don't want it to be that hot. I just put it on like a medium low and it went crazy on me. So let's give that a second just to slightly cool down. And while it's doing that, I can go ahead and come in here. Let me just put this on here so you can see a bit more closely. I'm just going to, look at how much those have bloomed. It's so beautiful. So I'm just going to try to come in here and gently, woo, with these, the one that's on the bottom, I'm going to try to see if I can bring it on top. It's going to obviously have more liquid, so that's going to help push, the heaviness of it is going to help push the bottom one into the liquid. It's probably they've absorbed about half of the liquid I have in here so far. Whatever liquid we end up with afterwards, it's totally fine. We're going to just bring it into the bigger pot of the menudo with us. So there we are so far with our snow mushrooms. So let's go ahead and get started with our chiles here. And I will need these tongs. I have a 1/4 cup of cooking oil. And I like to talk a little bit about the cooking oil, especially right now since I'm waiting for my heat to kind of cool down a little bit on my cast iron. So the cooking oil that I'm using today is grapeseed oil. It's my preferred cooking oil for home. For Todo Verde, we do use a organic rice bran oil. And you can use a avocado oil, you can use a vegetable oil, whatever your preferred oil is. I just ask that if it has a higher smoke point, which means it's more of a neutral oil, it doesn't burn easily, that is the preferred one. Extra virgin olive oil would not be a good example of an oil that has a high smoke point. You tend to burn the particles that are in the oil itself, the little bits of olive in there. And you get a little bit more of like bitter results. So I like to use grapeseed. I have a 1/4 cup here. I'm gonna pour about half or so in here now with the chiles. And then I will see how my oil is looking after I take the chiles out. And I will add more for the onion and garlic. So let me go ahead and drop my chiles in here. Let me turn my heat up. Now it's too cold. There we go. I can hear a little bit of sizzling happening. You definitely want to hear the sizzle. I had rinsed these off to get that sort of dirt off, like I mentioned, or dust off. And so that water against the oil is obviously going to create a little bit of sizzling. And these will take just a couple minutes. As that's going, I'm going to just put some hot water in my bowl. I'm just using hot tap water. You can absolutely boil some water if you wanted to, but my tap here gets really hot. All right, let me come back. I don't want to leave them too long. This is something that you definitely want to keep your eye on. You don't want to walk away too long. You can see a little bit of the browning that's happened here. And let me pan down a little bit more. You can see even more closely here. There we go, much better. Okay, so you can see some of the browning that I'm getting from the pan frying here on this chile here in this area. So I'm looking for that browning, slight blackening to happen. It's a little hard to see because the chiles themselves are pretty dark. But this should just take a few minutes. Here I'm already getting one that's pretty black. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and pull this one out. I don't want it to get any blacker than that. If it does, it's gonna be burning. All right. This one is ready to go too. And also the rule of thumb is like, if they're making you cough insanely and they're smoking a lot, you likely burn them. And the smoke that's coming off is from, you know, overcooking. All right. These are getting there. And all I'm doing is I have that bowl of hot tap water that I pulled, and I'm just dropping them into the water so they can start their rehydration process. And again, these smell really aromatic. They smell really good. They're going to make our broth even more delicious. And the reason I like to pan fry these versus dry toast, you can absolutely dry toast, but I like a little bit of fat in this menudo recipe because there's, you know, everything else is really lean, right? You know, the mushrooms don't have any fat. And so I want to be able to include some of that and kind of like flavor that a little bit with the chile. So it's like almost like we have a chili oil here that we're creating. I'm going to go ahead and drop in my onion and garlic. I'm just going to like kind of break up the pieces a little bit so that it goes just a bit faster versus having a big old chunk, a big old quarter. And I'm not going to cook these until they're all cooked through. Essentially what I want to do is just kind of soften the onion a little bit and get a little bit of color on them, a little bit of browning. Obviously this oil is already kind of tinted with the color of the chile. And so I just want to make sure that those soften slightly. They're obviously going to cook a whole lot more once they're in the liquid. Once they're in the menudo soup itself, they're going to cook all the way through. And I'm going to just set these chiles aside. They need about 10 minutes, like I mentioned, to rehydrate. And if your chiles, you can see what mine are looking like here. If your chiles are feeling like they're not fully submerged in the water, what you could do is you can use another bowl to just push them down into the liquid. I'm going to add the rest of my oil here. Again, that was a 1/4 cup total oil. So I just want to softly brown these, get them a little bit more tender. I should see a little bit of browning on the onion. I've tried making this menudo without doing this process, just going from raw onion and garlic into the blender with the rehydrated chiles. And obviously, like I mentioned, it's going to cook in the menudo on its own, right? Like it's going to go from raw onion to cooked in that cooking process of with the maiz and everything. And it's good. It still works perfectly fine. But I find that this is just going to add another slight layer of flavor. It's almost like if you have cooked meat before, people will sear, they'll sear, you know, the meat or whatever before they braise it or before they oven roast it, just to add a little bit of layer of flavor rather than just going from raw to just directly into a broth or a sauce and then cooking it that way. So I'm doing that same technique that you would see for lots of other dishes. I'm going to let that hang out for just a few minutes and let that brown a little bit more. And then I'll answer any questions that anybody has at this point. Or are we all good? And I see Susana getting her chiles in her water bowl. Perfect. That looks great. Okay, so I'm going to grab my cutting board. In a little bit, I'm going to start working on breaking down those mushrooms. So just getting my station all ready to go. All right, coming back to this onion and garlic, I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes to keep cooking here. And that'll also give my chiles that little bit of time, more time they need to rehydrate. And if you are kind of on the same boat as me, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not a huge onion and garlic fan for a couple different reasons, but mostly because like the yoga space that I'm a part of and other spaces that I'm a part of don't really believe that we should be eating onion and garlic on a regular basis. And I agree with that. And I don't eat it on a regular basis. It's more of like, it really calls for this and I need to eat it, or I'm feeling sick and I need some garlic or something. But there is a spice that I want to show you. Hopefully I found it. Okay. So you see this in Indian grocery stores. It's called, let me see if I can say it right, asafoetida. Asafoetida. And this has very much, when it's cooked, has this flavor of onion and garlic that it kind of gives in the back note of your ingredients. And I will say that a little bit goes a long way. If you add too much, it starts to overpower your dish. So you just want to add a touch of it to kind of give a little bit of that sort of umami-ness that onion and garlic provides. Again, it's called asafoetida. And what I've learned is that the dried version is good, but the fresh version, which is pretty hard to find, is much better. In fact, you typically find it here when people grow it themselves, like in their yard. And so just you know, another thing that you can have in your pantry if you want to cut down a little bit on that onion and garlic consumption. All right, I'm going to turn this down. I can see that I've created a nice amount of color, not on every single piece of onion, but more or less I see a little bit of browning or searing that's happened. My onion, let me show you this piece of garlic right here. So let me get in the frame. A little bit of browning there on that garlic clove and the others as well. You can see how beautifully caramelized that one is. So this is good for me. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off my heat. And then I'm going to start adding these pieces into my blender to break down even further. All right, let me grab that. Okay, so I'm gonna just grab these with my tongs, drop them into my blender. All right, someone overboard, but I got it. I think you can see my blender cup here, right? There we go. So I'm just literally dropping them into my Vitamix blender. I love this blender. High-powered blenders in general are a must-have, even in home kitchens. It's once you use them, it's hard to ever go back. I know that they have a higher price point, but Vitamixes also have a nice warranty to them. So if something does happen and it's not working properly, you can send it back and get it repaired, and then they send it back to you. And I just find that anything that you blend, from smoothies to broths to any purees, are just so much better when you're using a high power blender. I'm going to come back here. So I have my onion and garlic mixture in here. I'm going to grab my chiles. In an ideal world, I would probably let them soak just a little bit longer, but I want to keep this going. And I do have a Vitamix. And like I said, Vitamixes work really, really well in breaking everything down. And let me show you here what my rehydrated chiles are looking like. So essentially you can see it's like pretty soft and pliable. You can see that the skin of the chile has definitely thickened because it's absorbed this water. This one's really soft, it's folding over, and they're really easy to tear. And the longer they're in this liquid, the more that you'll see them. So I'm just going to drop all of my chiles into my blender cup with the onion and garlic. And then I'm going to add about a cup of this liquid to my mixture just to help blend it along. Let me get my measuring cup here. I'll get a half cup measure and just scoop out 2 times or pour out 2 times. So I'm going to put about a cup of liquid. And if I find that I need more to break this down into a smooth broth, I can always add more. Do not throw this broth away. This rehydrating liquid, it has the fattiness of the oil, it has the flavor of the chiles. And if you find that your menudo feels a bit thick, especially if you leave the mushrooms in there and they continue to rehydrate more in the broth of the menudo, you can always add a little bit of this rehydrating chile liquid to it to kind of loosen up your menudo generally, versus just adding water. It's going to flavor it so much more. The other thing that I'll add into my blender cup is the other half of the cumino. So I have a half teaspoon of cumin that's going in here. And I also have here, let me turn off this alarm that's going crazy there. There we go. And I also have here, I have 2 tablespoons of oregano, and I'm just using dried oregano. This is your regular store-bought oregano, which typically is Italian. And my Mexican oregano plant is struggling right now because I transferred it. But the difference between Italian and Mexican oregano is the flavor is slightly different, but also the leaf of the Italian oregano is much smaller. The Mexican oregano is probably about 4 to 5 times the size of these leaves that you see. And the flavor of the Mexican oregano feels a bit more spicy, not capsaicin, like like, you know, again, running for water spicy, but spicy in that like it feels like it packs more flavor in it. And so I'm going to add from these 2 tablespoons, 1 tablespoon to my blender that I want to get nice and blended and smooth. And then the other 1 tablespoon, I'm just going to add into the soup as is so that the pieces of oregano can rehydrate and blossom and be kind of seen in kind of speckles throughout the broth. But I like to add 1 tablespoon so that it's like blended smooth and I know it's like really penetrating into the broth itself. So let me go ahead and blend this until it becomes nice and smooth again, keeping the rehydrating chile liquid to see if I need any more of it. So as you can see, I blended for maybe a minute or so. And let me pan down so you can see the consistency here. So it should be a fairly smooth paste, not smooth like it doesn't have to be runny smooth, but smooth in that you shouldn't really see any bits of onion, garlic, or chile specks in there. If you do, you can add a bit more liquid to it and help your blender along to get it into all the pieces have really broken down. It's like a paste, so it'll be slightly thick. I'm gonna add just a touch more of my rehydrating liquid just to pulse it a little bit more and make sure that I don't see any bits of chile. I see like a few tiny bits. And if your blender is struggling and it can't quite get all those chile bits all the way broken down, what you could absolutely do is use a fine mesh strainer and strain this chile mixture through the fine mesh into your pot of your maize. So I'm just going to add about another touch, not too much, maybe about another half cup or so of my rehydrating liquid. And then I will go ahead and blend that up. So let me go back to the blender. Give me about another maybe 30 seconds to a minute. And then this should be complete. All right, so this should be good to go. Yeah, that looks much better. It's a little bit smoother. I don't see any bits of chile, onion, and garlic in there. I'm gonna grab my spatula, I'm gonna scrape it down, and then I'm gonna add all of this mixture to my big pot that has the maize in it. And I want that to cook. If you have the time, you can absolutely cook it for like a good, at least 20, 25, 30 minutes or so, that will really infuse into the maiz itself. Because right now it's been cooking in salted water essentially, and the water is flavored deliciously because of the maiz itself. But if you want the chile to really infuse into that maiz, then you can absolutely let that cook together a little while. So let me grab my pot handle here, and let's go ahead and go back to the stove. And what we're gonna do, let me pan over to this big old pot. I think you should be able to see right over it. There you go, there's the maiz. You can see it's steaming, it's very hot. And I'm just gonna pour in my mixture. I'm gonna scrape everything out. And remember, I still have that rehydrating liquid on standby just in case I need it. One thing I will do at this point, once I mix this all together, I've had it on super low heat this whole time because I didn't really want to cook it. I'm going to turn up the heat slightly because I only pan seared the onion and garlic enough to soften, but there's still a bit of a bite from the raw, slightly raw onion and garlic in this sauce. So I want this to cook. I want the onion and garlic to cook. So I'm going to turn up my heat to about a medium low heat until this comes to a simmer. And I want this to simmer until I'm sure that the onion and garlic is completely cooked through and that chile mixture has also infused into my maiz. I will also add the other tablespoon of my oregano here. And of course, I need a taste to see how the salt is feeling. So let me grab a spoon. I'm just gonna give the broth a little bit of a taste. And if it needs salt, I wanna salt it now. Ooh, that has a nice little kick to it. Just enough heat. I'm gonna go ahead and add a couple pinches of salt. It doesn't need too much. Again, I salted that maiz really well because I wanted it to have a nice flavor on its own. And my whole kitchen, my whole house smells like maiz. It's so good. All right, so I'm gonna let that hang out on that medium low heat on a simmer. Let me get this over here. I'm gonna put my lid on a jar. I don't want too much evaporation to happen. And I just want that to kind of hold some of that heat in there. And then let's go ahead and come back to my cutting board here. Let me clean up my station a little bit. Let's get back into these mushrooms. Okay. So it's not too hot, perfect. So I'm gonna pan down and I have my mushrooms here in the pot. And I'm just going to pull these mushrooms out with my tongs. This is the one that was sitting in the liquid to begin. And you can see just how soft and tender this is. And it, even if you feel like it has a bit of a touch that maybe still could use a little bit more rehydrating, you can absolutely leave them in your rehydrating liquid a little bit longer. But these are going to go in the menudo broth, so they're also going to absorb some of that liquid too, and they should definitely get nice and soft. So all I want to do is I want to use my knife to just break these down into bite-sized pieces. So I'm going to cut them into strips essentially, and then I'm going to cut those strips into smaller bite-sized pieces. So you can see here, like, look at that texture. Look at how it has that sort of stomach lining look and feel. And then if I give it a taste, it should taste mostly like the rehydrating liquid that I had it in. The snow mushrooms themselves don't have a super distinct flavor. If you were using the oyster mushrooms, the fresh ones that we mentioned earlier, you could definitely cook them, or not cook them, but have them sort of start to kind of wilt down and cook in a warmer hot liquid like we did, and then add them to the bigger pot. They likely won't need as much of the rehydrating liquid because obviously these are dried mushrooms and fresh mushrooms are not dried, so they don't need as much liquid to bring them back to sort of pliability. So you can use less, perhaps even like half of the rehydrating mixture to get to the point where they're nice and soft and ready to go into the bigger pot. So just breaking these down until I get these like nice bite-sized pieces. I have found that on the bottom, this one isn't as colorful as this one. So you can see that this was on the bottom of the mushroom, and it's kind of what holds it all together. And sometimes it's a little bit more tough than the, you know, the top pieces of the mushroom. So if you find that yours, even after it's rehydrated, that it's still a little bit too tough, you can absolutely cut that off. And, you know, check yours out and see how it's feeling. For me, this is fine. I don't like to have a lot of food waste, so it's not like I would want to toss this. What I would probably do is just eat this before it goes in the pot, you know? So totally your call there. But if it is really hard, like it's not rehydrating, you should remove it because you don't want any like tough pieces in there. So you can see here how this is the area that holds the mushroom together. And it's a little bit more firm to the touch, but it's still soft. It's still pliable. It's definitely not as pliable as the top portion. So just going through and cutting that up. And so that way, when you grab a spoonful, you have this nice bite-sized piece ready to go. And I'm gonna add this to the pot. I know right now I'm cooking the broth with the maiz for, I said it could be anywhere from like 20, 25 to 30 minutes or so, just to really let those flavors infuse. I'm gonna drop these in more towards the last, you know, 10 minutes of that, just because they don't need a whole lot of time in that liquid. They just need enough to kind of get coated and get some of that flavor. And this is why I like to use the vegetable broth with a little bit of cumin and taste it for salt and make sure that this alone tastes good, so that you don't have these like super bland, unflavored pieces of snow mushroom that's going on at the end, and then it just doesn't really add anything to the overall dish itself. It's just the textural point. Like I want this to also taste good, aside from being a texture that looks so much like menudo. All right, let me grab these two bits out or pieces out, and I'm going to transfer these bits back into the pot. And let me show you out of that how it was 4 cups of liquid, and it was probably about halfway filled, this pot. There's probably about a cup that still remains here, and this can totally go into the larger pot. It's flavor, it's, you know, the broth is really delicious, so this can go, whatever remains can definitely go in. I'm going to go ahead and drop my sliced pieces back into the pot. So I'll use it as sort of a holding bowl until I'm ready to drop those all into my larger pot. I just need more room on my cutting board here. Any other questions coming through as we're breaking down these mushrooms? I know for a lot of folks, this is a new ingredient to you. So, but hopefully it seems fairly easy to work with, right? It's like pretty straightforward, not too much fuss. And the flavor is like perfect. See, this one for me, the texture is too hard to use. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that out. I don't want to use that. Let me cut that out here. It doesn't have to be a whole lot of it, just enough to get that, like the hard bits. And you'll feel the difference if you're like, ooh, if I was eating this soup and I bit into that, it would not be awesome. You want to cut that out. All right. And you can determine what bite size means to you. For some people, you want to, you know, maybe break it down a bit further. For me, I like to have that nice, you know, bit of larger texture to it, even though it's still bite size, because I want to be able to see it. I want it to be a prominent part of the dish. I don't want it to feel like it's all minced up. And you can absolutely use a slotted spoon to pull them out of the broth. I just use my tongs because I've been using that, but you can use like a spider or slotted spoon to pull them out to try to avoid getting a huge amount of the liquid on your cutting board. All right, these are all good to go. So that is going to get dropped into our menudo in just a moment. Because of time here, I'm going to pretend that more time has passed and that more, you know, that broth has cooked for a little bit more time and that our onion and garlic, you know, that raw flavor has mellowed. But at home, really let it let it do its thing. But here, because we're on a time crunch with the class, I want to make sure that you're able to see the final dish and that you see all the steps properly and that you have time to ask questions, the whole thing. Let me give my hand a rinse. So let's pretend it's been about 15, 20 minutes. I think it's been about, I don't know, 5 to 10. And you can see here that my broth is simmering and that my, let me bring my ladle over, that my oregano has definitely started to increase in size. And you can see when I pull out the maiz, it's already stained, right? It has that nice chile look to it. So it looks like it's been cooking in there for a little bit. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to drop in my mushrooms here. I'm gonna carefully drop them in. You can use that same slotted spoon, the tongs, or you can carefully use your hands, making sure that you're not splashing that hot liquid back at you. And once this is in, I want to taste my broth once more, just to make sure that the flavor is still all good. It should be, because I've salted and I've tasted each element. And so it should be pretty good to go. Wow, this is a huge pot of menudo that I'm so excited about. All right, let me give my hand another rinse here. Look at how much that's looking like menudo already. Let me go ahead and mix that all in. Check that out, everybody. Look at how quickly that has stained. And this is the nice, perfect consistency of the broth. You can see that the broth has body to it. The broth, because of the chiles, the onion, the garlic, because of the starchiness of the maiz, the broth itself is like, wow. That, I mean, that for me is what makes a perfect caldo, whether it's menudo or anything else, is that the broth should be on its own a winner, because then everything in it is going to taste good. And so I would let this just keep cooking for the last 10 minutes or so with the mushrooms in it. And the mushrooms will be fine if, for example, you are reheating. It'll be totally fine. However, I just find that if they're in there too long, my broth just gets like a little bit too thick. So I prefer to eat this immediately. But if you do have to chill this in the fridge overnight for tomorrow or whatever, you could absolutely do that. And if it over thickens on you, you could add a little bit more broth, a little bit more water to loosen it. Or of course, if you want to reserve the rest of your chile liquid, you can add a little bit of that liquid to it to just loosen it up if it gets too thick. What's really important, one time I did try to make this dish, again, trying to create a shortcut with the maiz, because the maiz just takes such a long time. And the maiz was not all the way fully cooked, and I was just trying to rush through and get the dish completed. And so I still had to keep cooking the maiz even longer. Like I tasted a few pieces and they felt fine, but I was like, you know what, it really does need a little bit more time. And I had the mushrooms in there and it did thicken up quite a bit. I had to loosen it a couple times, but it was still really good. So it'll be fine, but if you use this method, you'll yield more of like a true to form, kind of true texture that this soup should look like. So again, let's kind of pretend that some time has passed here and that this is cooked for about an additional, 10 minutes, that it's come to a simmer. And let's start plating. So I want to just show what the final dish is going to look like. I'm just going to clean up my station again here and then get everything ready to go. Actually, I need my cutting board for some cilantro. Any other questions as I'm getting the last part of it ready to go? Everybody's good? It's pretty easy, right? All right. All right, and before I pull the actual menudo out for the final plating, let me just show you some of the toppings. So if you've had menudo before, you know what the toppings are, Maybe not everyone has had menudo, or maybe not had it in a while, right? That could be the case too. So for folks who have not had menudo before, the toppings are definitely different than pozole. Pozole, you also see cilantro and onion, but you see repollo, which is what is it called in English? Cabbage. Sliced cabbage, thinly sliced cabbage. You also see radishes. This is for pozole, right? Radishes, cabbage, onion, cilantro, lemon. You see tostadas. So it's a deep fried or toasted tortillas, and they're nice and crunchy. And so that's pozole. Menudo, you see these ingredients. And you still see the cilantro and the onion, like I mentioned, the lemon. And I need to get my cilantro out of the fridge, actually. But what you see is people will use a little bit of chile quebrado, or a little bit of crushed red chili flakes. And the chile flakes kind of depend on what the region is or what people prefer. It could be chile piquin, or it could be just regular chile quebrado. You'll see a little bit more oregano. When I was a kid, I used to love grabbing oregano and like putting it in the palm of my hand and doing this over the bowl of menudo. That was like everything. I don't know why. And then menudo absolutely is eaten with fresh tortillas. So if you get handmade tortillas, just freshly made with this, it's like the best. And what I used to do, I'm just going to use pre-made tortillas today, but what I used to do is I used to love to like put the hot tortilla in my hand and then put my other hand on top and roll it into almost like a taquito shape, and then dunk the tortilla into the menudo broth and like take a bite and spoonful and a bite and a spoonful. And that was kind of the ideal way that I used to eat menudo. I also have here some thinly diced red onion, some Meyer lemons from my tree in my backyard. I'm gonna grab a little bit of cilantro and mince it from my fridge, and then we're gonna start plating it up.
Jocelyn, someone on Instagram asked us if we had ever made this recipe with the vegan queso panela. Have you ever tried that before?
I've never had cheese in menudo. I don't know if that's common for anyone. Has anyone here ever had cheese in menudo? I think that's not ever done. Unless maybe that's like their family. Some families have like their own traditions, but no, I've never seen that. It's all quiet, crickets. Do you add butter to your like what? I've never seen that. Okay. Just look away, everybody, okay? All right. So I just have my cilantro that I'm just mincing up here. And then I'm going to just add that to this tiny little bowl. I chose the tiniest little bowl here to add my garnishes, but hey, it's gonna work. And then let me go ahead and grab a ladle full of my menudo to bring into my bowl here. All right, let me grab my bowl, take this lid off. I can see that my menudo is coming to a simmer again, because obviously every time I add something that's a little bit cooler in temperature, it drops the heat. So it needs to kind of come back, and it's a lot more in here now. So this serves like 4 to 6 people. I know it seems like a lot. This pot is probably like maybe like a 6-quart pot. So it could easily serve 6 people, 4 really hungry folks who maybe you'll eat like a really large bowl or a second bowl. I like to say 4 to 6 because like in my family, it'd be like, well, you said 6 people, like this is for 3, you know? So it really depends on like how hungry your eaters are. So I'm ladling on and making sure that I'm getting a good amount of maiz, and that I'm also getting a good amount of the mushrooms, and that they're visible, and that the broth, there's enough broth in there. I'll leave it this way about half filled so I can come back to plating here. Let me remove my ladle so it doesn't get all hot on me. Cover that again, let that keep going. And I am going to bring my plate here. So I have my plate of menudo, my bowl of menudo. I'm gonna sprinkle in a little bit of that red, thinly diced onion, just to give a little freshness, a little crunch. And it's gonna, because the menudo itself is so hot, it's gonna kind of mellow out the rawness of it because it's so hot. And then of course, let me get this cilantro that I have on the cutting board. A little bit of cilantro, as much as you'd like. And these are usually there on the table if you go to a restaurant or even family gathering, for each person to add as much as they want. So it's really up to the eater on like how much onion, how much cilantro, how much chile, whatever they want to add to it. I'm going to add a nice pinch of chile quebrado just to give it a little kick. Again, the broth itself is not too spicy because the chiles are not very spicy chiles. I'm going to add a pinch of oregano. I'm going to do my childhood favorite task on a Sunday morning, a little bit of oregano crumbles, and then a nice squeeze of limon. And this is ready to go. I'm going to add a little bit more limon because I love it to be nice and acidic. So of course you can use lime. I also tend to lean more towards lemons because here in LA, lemons grow in abundance and you can find them locally, especially like at farmers markets, whereas limes are grown in Mexico and imported. So I prefer, just for the whole locally sourced reason, to use lemons versus limes. And I'm gonna grab my spoon. And if I had my tortilla, I'm gonna warm up a tortilla right after this class, but you can use, again, like the pre-made tortillas. I have kernel of true tortillas on hand all the time here in my fridge. They're the best tortilla, I believe, in Los Angeles, if you're local to this area, and you can buy them at Cookbook Market in Echo Park, Highland Park, Grassroots Market in South Pass, and Sarah's Market in City Terrace. And they just use organic, non-GMO corn. It's US grown corn as well. And they just have the best tortillas. They're so good. They have blue corn and yellow corn. So let me grab my towel because this bowl is enamel and it's hot underneath. And let's see how our pozole, see, I'm already getting it all mixed up. Our menudo is doing. So it's so hot. I'm gonna give it a little bit of a taste.